a shattered ceramic pot, a trickle of urine soaking into Persian carpet, a parlor thick with lavender water and ammonia. The maid who found it didn't scream. She didn't dare. She quietly fetched another rug, mopped up the liquid with her apron, and disposed of the mess before the house guests returned from their promenade. No one ever mentioned it again. This was the fate of Margaret Ellery, eldest daughter of a wealthy cotton merchant, a girl raised to glide across drawing rooms and never speak of what her body required. She was 7 years old when she first leaked on a velvet footstool, caught between Victorian decency and her own confused anatomy. Today we reveal the hidden world beneath the skirts, how Victorian women relieved themselves inside mountains of fabric, among layers of etiquette, shame, and silent engineering. Margaret was born in 1838 in a row house on London's Russell Square. The air smelled of soot and rotting cabbage, but her nursery was scented with rose oil and camphor. Her mother, Augusta Ellery, bathed in milk and wore linen undergarments pressed with beeswax. Margaret would later inherit the same regimen, though no one told her how it all ended at the chamber pot. Like most upper-class girls, Margaret's early years were managed by nannies and governesses. Her days were a procession of stiff posture, embroidery samplers, elocution lessons, and frilly pinafores. Her diet consisted of white bread, boiled beef, and oversteeped tea, a constipation-inducing menu that, according to some fringe health theorists of the era, was intentional. The less a lady excreted, the more refined she appeared. Or so it was whispered in the drawing rooms of Chelsea. At age 10, Margaret was taught the word water closet. Not by her mother. Heavens, no. But by a nursery maid who showed her how to perch delicately on a portable commode hidden behind a folding screen. Don't let your knees part, the maid had whispered, and tuck the back of your dress up like a swan's tail. Margaret nodded, confused and mortified. The Victorian home, especially for the wealthy, was a contradiction. Technological marvels coexisted with medieval practices. Some houses had piped-in water and even flushing toilets. Others relied on chamber pots, earth closets, or the occasional outdoor privy. The Ellerys had 2 WCs, one upstairs, one in the scullery, and yet Margaret was taught never to use them when guests were present. The sound of urine hitting water, after all, could ruin a dinner party. Historians still argue whether it was shame, class, or plumbing limitations that dictated such rules. Some blame Queen Victoria's own prudishness. Her well-documented horror at anatomical drawings may have set a national tone. Others suggest the real culprit was fashion itself. At 13, Margaret received her first real dress. Not a child's frock, but a full-bodied, corset-tight, bell-shaped affair. It came with 6 petticoats, whalebone stays, and a bustle that jutted out like a padded shelf behind her. Movement became a calculated process. Sitting required strategy, and relieving herself? That became an ordeal. Imagine, if you will, a girl wrapped in 20 pounds of fabric, tightly laced from breast to hip, attempting to navigate a chamber pot barely wider than a hatbox. There were no zippers, no elastic waistbands. Every act of relief required planning, assistance, and silence. The first time Margaret tried it, she cried. Her mother dismissed the maid who had instructed her, blaming indecent conduct. The next maid used a diagram sketched in chalk on the nursery floor. Knees here, pot here, hold your skirts like this. It took weeks of practice before Margaret stopped shaking during the ordeal. Some Victorian girls were taught to use a bordaloo, a porcelain vessel shaped like a gravy boat, designed to be discreetly tucked beneath the skirts and emptied later. Bordaloos could be used while standing or perched on the edge of a seat. In theory, it was elegance incarnate. In practice, it often ended in spillage. Margaret never trusted hers. She swore she could hear it sloshing. The bodily training continued into adolescence. There were lectures on tight lacing, dietary moderation, and the importance of self-control. One physician wrote that women who needed to relieve themselves too often were likely unrefined in temperament or suffering from hysteria. A fringe manual recommended walnut consumption to reduce urination. Another proposed an absurd herbal paste applied to the lower spine. These ideas, while fringe, were not considered laughable at the time. As Margaret entered society at 17, she learned to fake composure with astonishing skill. Long dinners, carriage rides, and theater performances all required bladder strategy. Women like her developed iron discipline, or else learned the secret language of maids and screened alcoves. It is said that Queen Victoria herself, when presented with a mechanical bidet imported from France, recoiled and demanded it be burned at once. Cleanliness? Yes. Technology? Perhaps. But bodily honesty? Never. The domestic sphere was supposed to be clean, fragrant, and spiritual. And yet, under every polished floorboard lurked a stink of human truth. Indoor plumbing remained patchy even in the 1860s. The Thames was still thick with waste. Women carried smelling salts in case they passed too close to a sewer grate. Those who could afford it kept oranges studded with cloves in their reticules. And still, even then, Margaret would sometimes wake with damp sheets, not from a childish accident, but from a nightmare of failing at dinner, spilling herself in front of peers. The shame would wake her gasping. By the time she married, at 19, to a widowed banker with gout, Margaret had learned to hide her needs completely. She became a master of the half-smile, the barely raised hand to signal a maid, the discreet nod toward the dressing screen. Her chamber pot was polished, porcelain, rimmed in gold. She never used it without praying. Beneath the crinoline, there was another world, a strange, precarious kingdom of loops, slings, sashes, linen pads, and silence. By the 1850s, Margaret's dresses had become architectural. Supported by whalebone hoops and steel cage crinolines, they could span nearly 5 feet in diameter. They rustled like sails and moved with a breeze of their own. These were not clothes. They were mechanisms. And they came with invisible demands. To move gracefully was to manage an unwieldy contraption of physics. To relieve oneself was to enter a clandestine ritual that required memory, balance, and, if she was fortunate, assistance from a trusted maid. Not every woman had one. The crinoline, adopted widely by mid-century, was hailed as liberating by fashion columnists. At last the legs breathe, one 1856 magazine declared. What it failed to mention was that the enormous hoop skirts made sitting difficult, doorways treacherous, and discreet toileting nearly impossible. Inside this circumference of rustling fabric, women developed internal strategies for privacy. Margaret's maid, Elsie, taught her the squat and flare, a practiced bend of the knees combined with a deft lifting of the back panels, careful not to tilt the entire steel frame forward. There were no mirrors under the dress, just instinct and fear. "Mind the chamber," Elsie would whisper, crouching behind the dressing screen. "Don't tip it with your heel." Victorian chamber pots varied in design, some round and shallow, others tall and lidded, but all had one thing in common. They were ill-suited to the human body in a cage. A mainstream etiquette guide from 1858 suggested women hover in confidence, a phrase as unhelpful then as it sounds now. Margaret learned to brace her arms on the chair arms while her skirts formed a bell around her. The chamber pot waited beneath like a trap. The smell of ammonia, floral perfume, and starch formed a signature scent. Some households, especially during travel, used lady conveniences, small wooden cabinets disguised as stools, their lids hiding portable pots. More discreet women carried bordelos or urinettes in their reticules, though some were shaped so awkwardly they resembled a shoehorn crossed with a gravy boat. These urinal devices were typically porcelain, with soft lips to avoid splashing, though wealthier women sometimes had silver versions engraved with initials. Margaret owned one, a wedding gift from a French cousin. It was encased in velvet, rarely used, and eventually thrown out after an incident involving a carriage ride to Hampstead and an ill-timed bump in the road. The act of relieving oneself was never openly discussed, but it governed every event. Before each outing, Margaret calculated her window, the bladder's endurance, the distance to the destination, the availability of privacy. There were no public toilets for women. Men had urinals, pay lavatories, even spittoons. Women had alleys, dark corners, or their own ingenuity. During theater intermissions, many ladies simply refused to move. To leave one's seat meant risking exposure, not just to the body, but of the fact that one had a body. Instead, they stayed stiffly upright, breath shallow, corsets pinching organs. Margaret recalled a dinner at which a duchess fainted not from emotion, but from suppressing her bowels for 14 hours. Her honor leaked, someone whispered afterward. By the 1860s, some innovators attempted to address the issue. A fringe entrepreneur in Manchester began producing female urinary devices, early funnels made of rubber or tin, designed to allow women to urinate standing up, like men. The public was scandalized. A newspaper mocked the devices as pipes of wanton liberty. Few women admitted to owning them, but they quietly sold out. Historians still debate whether Queen Victoria herself used one. There is no official record, but a household receipt from 1864 lists silver funnel, ladies' form, among her private purchases. Whether it was used for urination, childbirth, or something else entirely remains unknown. Margaret never dared. She distrusted anything mechanical. Her body obeyed rules of posture and timing. She drank little during the day, avoided citrus, and chewed fennel seeds. Spice curbs the stream, Elsie once claimed. It wasn't true, but Margaret clung to it anyway. Even among women, the topic remained taboo. The mechanics of crinoline toileting were passed in whispers between sisters and cousins. Girls taught each other how to slide the rear hoop upward, balancing it on the small of the back. Others learned to press the front cage down with their knees, creating a fleeting gap. One girl Margaret knew was caught outside the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1854, weeping beside a shrub. Her dress had gotten caught in a gate, and she had urinated down both stockings before help arrived. She married the following year and never spoke to Margaret again. There were darker stories. Women who developed infections from holding their waist too long. One maid who died of sepsis after her bordella shattered in a fall. Another who was dismissed after being accused of foul leakage in the Marquis's library. Doctors rarely addressed these matters. Female anatomy was only beginning to be understood or even acknowledged as separate from male norms. One scholar in 1861 declared that ladies' bowels ought not to be stimulated by medicine, but by moral restraint. Another proposed a daily schedule of mental tasks to distract from the animal function. Some of these men were knighted. Behind closed doors, Margaret's life became a choreography of bodily management. She avoided spicy food. She planned walks with mapped-out benches. She learned to identify which houses in Mayfair had second-floor powder rooms, and which required a pot-under-chair arrangement. The irony was that in all this, she was not considered ill. On the contrary, Margaret was seen as the very picture of womanly composure. Tall, refined, modest. What no one saw, what they weren't meant to see, was the ritual beneath the rustle of satin. The chamber pot placed under a side table during long visits. The practiced hitch of the skirts. The moment of grim silence before the trickle began. And always, always, the scent of rose water afterward. The applause thundered through the concert hall, but Margaret didn't hear it. She sat stiffly in her velvet-upholstered chair, hands clasped in her lap, eyes forward, body screaming for release. Her bladder ached. Her corset cut into her lower ribs. She calculated the minutes, until intermission, like a soldier waiting for nightfall. 10 more. Just 10. This was the other side of refinement. Public decency, private desperation. Victorian women lived in a world that prized appearances above physiology. In public, they were porcelain dolls, genteel, fragrant, and infallibly contained. Inside, they were sweating, trembling, and calculating how long they could hold a bodily function before their entire social standing shattered. There were no public toilets for women in London until 1889. The fear was not merely about modesty. It was control. Giving women access to public lavatories meant admitting they had bodies, and that their presence in the public sphere was legitimate. So for decades, they were forced to improvise. During long carriage rides, women would wear absorbent cloth pads tucked discreetly between their legs, what some referred to as soak pads. These were not modern sanitary napkins. They were thick, awkward, and often reused. Their purpose was dual: menstrual absorption and emergency urination. A fringe pamphlet from 1867 mentions women lining their drawers with layers of flannel in case of need. Margaret herself had tried it once, during a visit to Brighton. It had been humiliating, clammy, and insufficient. The upper crust, of course, had options. Portable commodes could be stashed in carriages. Hostesses often provided discreet chamber chairs, elegantly upholstered seats that lifted to reveal a hidden pot. But these conveniences assumed a level of intimacy or wealth. For women navigating rail stations, public parks, or busy arcades, there was nothing. Nothing but strategy. Margaret learned to master what was called the ballroom bladder. Young women at social dances would restrict fluid intake for hours before events. Wine, soup, even tea were refused. A dry stomach was safer than a full one. But the price was dizziness, headaches, and the occasional fainting spell. No one ever linked it to dehydration. Elsie, ever practical, carried a pouch of dried gooseberry in her apron. "Chew one," she'd say. "It tricks the tongue." Whether it worked or not, it was a placebo Margaret came to depend on. There was one night, summer of 1863, when Margaret lost the battle. It was during a reception at Lady Wentham's townhouse. The music was waltzes, the lights gaslit and golden. Margaret, encased in a peacock blue crinoline trimmed with glass beads, had danced twice with a Swedish diplomat. He smelled like leather and clove cigarettes. She was flushed, elated, and full of confidence when she felt it. The unmistakable pressure in her abdomen, sudden and sharp. She excused herself as gracefully as she could and made for the corner parlor, where she knew, from gossip, a chamber screen was kept. But the room was locked. The next one had no screen, only card tables. Panic rose. Her skirts swished dangerously as she moved from room to room, pretending to admire portraits, nodding at acquaintances. Every step was a drumbeat of urgency. Finally, she found Elsie in the side hall. One look at Margaret's face, and the maid knew. They found a service closet, dark and lined with coats. There was a pail for coal. Not ideal, but better than humiliation. Elsie positioned it, lifted the dress, whispered calming nonsense. It was over in less than a minute. And yet, to Margaret, it felt like the longest hour of her life. They burned the coat afterward. This incident was never spoken of again. Margaret returned to the ballroom, composed, though pale. She danced once more, drank a cordial, and went home before midnight. Her shoes were damp, her dignity barely intact. The psychological cost of such moments cannot be overstated. Victorian women were trained to associate shame with their own biology. A successful evening meant no sign of bodily presence, no stains, no odors, no interruptions. Some developed nervous disorders. Others fainted from retention. One fringe theory suggested that the high rates of female hysteria were simply undiagnosed urinary infections and menstrual cramps ignored too long. Mainstream medicine offered little help. Male doctors routinely dismissed female discomfort. Hysteria was the catch-all diagnosis. In Margaret's case, she was prescribed lavender drops and cold compresses for nervous tension. Not once was she asked about her toileting habits. But there were quiet rebels. By the 1870s, a few progressive thinkers began advocating for public lavatories for women. The Ladies' Sanitary Association pushed for hygiene reform and proper access. Pamela Colson, an obscure pamphleteer, wrote in 1872 that a woman ought not suffer indignity simply for needing to relieve herself. Her words were mocked at the time. Piss and petticoats, one critic jeered. But her ideas endured. Margaret, now older and more discreet, followed these debates from the safety of her salon. She clipped articles, underlined passages, but she never spoke of them aloud. She hosted musical evenings, held charity auctions, and sipped broth with gloved hands. Behind closed doors, she still relied on her chamber pot. It stood beneath a velvet cover in her dressing room, beside a porcelain pitcher of water and a tin of rose powder. She never went to the theater again. Even in death, the shame remained. When Margaret passed at age 64, her belongings were inventoried by her niece. Among the items listed, 9 lace-trimmed petticoats, 1 gold-rimmed bordaloo, and 4 sealed journals. In the final volume, dated 1896, a single line reads, "Sometimes I still dream of that locked door." The year was 1897. The city of London choked under coal smoke and industry. Women, more of them than ever, walked the streets with purpose now. Not just wives or widows, but typists, clerks, even students. Margaret's world, with its flounces and fainting couches, was fading. But one thing had not changed. There was still nowhere to go. For the women of this new, half-modern era, the burden was heavier because it was more visible. They rode omnibuses. They worked in shops. They attended lectures. And, at every turn, they were faced with a silent dilemma: how to relieve themselves in a society that refused to admit they needed to. Margaret's niece, Clara, was a different creature altogether. She wore her corsets looser, her boots practical, her mind sharply tuned to questions of fairness. Where Margaret had endured in silence, Clara wrote angry letters to editors. "Do you expect us to urinate in flower beds?" she once asked in a public forum, under a pseudonym. The paper refused to print it, but others had begun to agitate as well. The Ladies' Sanitary Association, originally a temperance-adjacent charity, took up the cause in earnest. By the late 1880s, they lobbied city councils to provide what they called retiring rooms, a genteel euphemism for women's lavatories. The backlash was swift and moralistic. Opponents claimed such facilities would encourage loose morals, and that respectable women would never be in need of them. Yet the truth was far more grotesque. Clara and her friends, when shopping on Regent Street, often ducked into the back doors of sympathetic dressmakers or used the wash basins of crowded tea rooms. The less fortunate had no options. One rainy afternoon, Clara saw a woman in morning clothes dart into a side alley, holding up her skirts. She waited 5 minutes, then emerged, red-faced and wet-eyed. That night, Clara burned with shame, for herself, for the city, for the world Margaret had left her. And so she decided to document it. Using the format of a domestic journal, she began to record the toileting strategies of Victorian women. It was not a book of etiquette, but of survival. She titled it, "Behind the Skirts, Private Rights of Public Women." She included testimonies, some anonymous, others scrawled with initials, describing everything from makeshift urinals to secret chamber closets hidden behind shop counters. One laundress wrote, "We'd run down to the Thames if we had to. The boats don't care, but the bobbies might." Another recalled stuffing straw into her drawers during a long train ride, then standing in the vestibule with a blanket as cover. Clara's entries became more detailed, more defiant. She interviewed midwives who described their patients' internal injuries, often caused by retention strain. One young girl, barely 15, had ruptured her bladder after being told she could not leave a school chapel service. She died within 3 days. Historians now debate the full extent of such cases. Some believe they were exaggerated, passed down in the spirit of caution. Others insist the medical records, scarce though they are, support the claims. What is certain is this: Victorian dress, modesty, and morality formed a trifecta of control that made female bodily autonomy nearly impossible. The fashion itself, even as it changed, conspired in silence. By the 1890s, the crinoline had given way to the bustle, then to the slimmer princess line gowns. These seemed more manageable, but the understructure persisted. Padded undergarments, tight-laced waists, and multi-layered drawers made sudden bathroom needs a complex ritual. Margaret, in her final years, witnessed this evolution with quiet astonishment. "They move like reeds," she once wrote in a letter to a friend. "And yet the burden is heavier now, for they are supposed to be free." She was not wrong. In 1898, Clara attended a public demonstration in Hyde Park, dozens of women demanding the right to vote, but also, more quietly, the right to urinate with dignity. Some carried placards reading, "We stand all day, give us a place to sit." Others distributed handbills listing all known female-friendly lavatory locations in the city. There were 3. Still, the press laughed. A cartoon in Punch showed a line of women lifting skirts in unison behind Buckingham Palace. The caption read, "Votes and privies." Yet change came slowly. The first public ladies' convenience opened in Camden in 1899. It was small, cramped, and guarded by a matron with a whistle, but it was a beginning. The fee was a penny. For that, a woman received not just a moment's relief, but an act of rebellion. Clara visited it twice, then sent her aunt's Bordelou to a local museum with a note. "This is what we used when we were not allowed to exist." Back in her home, Clara opened one of Margaret's old trunks. Inside was a moth-eaten skirt, faded blue, stiff with age. At the bottom was a packet of handwritten instructions, Elsie's notes. They detailed how to fold the back panel, where to place the chamber pot, what angles worked best under pressure. It was a manual of secrecy, passed like scripture. Clara wept, not because of the burden, but because it had gone unspoken so long. There were stories still. Tales of queens peeing in golden bowls, of actresses relieving themselves behind painted sets, of governesses forced to use chamber pots in freezing attics, because the children's nursemaid had claimed the only one. Clara wrote them all down. She spoke to tailors about hidden slits in petticoats, to carpenters about disguised commodes. A fringe upholsterer in Soho claimed to have built a fainting couch that doubled as a privy for a countess too ashamed to walk the hall. Some of it sounded absurd, but none of it was funny. The real punchline was this: Victorian women managed their needs not because they were weak, but because society demanded they be invisible, even in their most human moments. And every time they lifted those layers of linen and lace, they carried that weight. The heat wave of 1901 broke records and bodies. Clerks collapsed in counting houses, milk turned sour before noon, and the air inside corsets was described by one newspaper as suffocating as old velvet drapes left in a privy. In that same summer, Clara visited an exhibition at the Crystal Palace. It was called The Domestic Marvels of Empire, and hidden among the marvels of steam irons and tea kettles was a small, nondescript booth with gilded signage. The modern woman's necessity, hygienic solutions for the female traveler. Inside stood a single object, a gleaming porcelain pedestal toilet with a flush lever and mahogany seat, designed specifically for women, complete with adjustable height, angled privacy screen, and a discreet padded step for crinoline clearance. Clara stared at it like a relic from the future. She asked the attendant, a bored man with mustard on his collar, if it would be available for public use soon. He shrugged. Unlikely. No call for it. No call. Despite the suffering, the improvisation, the silence, society still refused to acknowledge the call of nature. And especially not from a woman. Yet, behind that indifference, something had shifted. By the dawn of the Edwardian era, women were no longer willing to just endure. In letters, in lectures, in whispered anecdotes passed from aunt to niece, the taboo had been broken. They told stories of train rides with no stops, of park benches with hidden latrines, of the indignity of leaking into one's stockings during a royal procession. And those stories began to seep into public consciousness like ink into linen. Some were horrific. One servant girl wrote anonymously in a pamphlet circulated among domestic workers. I was locked in the pantry for 5 hours while the lady was away. There was no pot. I used the flour bin. I was dismissed the next morning. Another, a schoolteacher, confessed to slipping into the coal shed between classes because the headmaster refused to build a second lavatory. A teacher should control her faculties, he said. She resigned. Historians still argue over how widespread these private tragedies were. The records are spotty. The shame was omnipresent. But the stories persist, and they tell a tale more visceral than any census or architecture plan. The clothing tells it too. In 1902, an undergarment catalog advertised a new innovation: split drawers for speed and safety. Designed for faster use of chamber pots or public toilets, these drawers featured an open seam between the legs, hidden by layers of lace. They were a quiet revolution, and they spread. Seamstresses offered custom alterations. Mothers taught daughters how to squat without lifting their skirts. Tailoring became survival. Of course, the patriarchy mocked them. A popular vaudeville act that year featured a song called Lift and Let Fly, complete with dancing petticoats and exaggerated sound effects. Men laughed. Women winced. But beneath the ridicule was fear. Fear of women mastering even this most basic function. To pee freely was, in some small way, to rebel. Clara kept collecting. She stored every letter, every pattern, every anecdote in a lacquered box labeled Necessary Truths. Inside was Margaret's journal, Elsie's handwritten diagrams, and a small, cracked bordelot with a chipped gold rim. She considered publishing them, but her printer refused. No market for female evacuations, he said, smiling over his pipe. So Clara waited. In 1904, a new building opened on Oxford Street. It featured wide windows, marble floors, and, on the second level, a full ladies' lavatory. 3 cubicles. 1 sink. A place to sit, in privacy, without shame. It cost 2pence. Clara went the first week it opened. She sat not because she needed to, but because she could. She closed her eyes and remembered Margaret, pale and proud, trembling in that closet beside a coal pail. She whispered a thank you to no one. Years later, in 1911, when suffragettes chained themselves to railings and smashed shop windows, some brought with them chamber pots. Not to use, but to symbolize what they had endured. One scrawled across the porcelain, "Our needs are not obscene." The police confiscated them. Today, historians recognize the bordelot not just as a museum piece, but as a symbol. It sits in dusty glass cases, silent, absurd-looking, yet essential. Visitors laugh at its dainty shape, its floral patterns. Few understand its urgency. Fewer still understand its cost. The real legacy of Victorian women is not the dresses or the etiquette. It is the quiet endurance of their bodies beneath those dresses. The clenched fists, the careful planning, the whispered codes. Every layer of crinoline hid 1,000 decisions: where to go, how to go, when not to go. Even now, some of their strategies survive, hidden in our habits. The purse carried to the bathroom, the coded glances at a friend across the room, the whispered "watch my drink." Echoes of a time when simply needing relief could risk one's reputation. Margaret died never knowing relief would one day be public, affordable, and dignified. Clara lived just long enough to see it become expected. And today, in every restroom line, in every discreet trip to the stall, their silent history lives on. Word count, 1,234. Wind down, 300 words. The dresses are gone now. The corsets unhooked, the layers folded away into trunks and memories. But the silence, that long, tightly wrapped silence, still lingers. You can hear it in museum galleries, where bordelots sit under glass, misunderstood. You can feel it in the softness of a powder room mirror, in the hush of footsteps across tile, in the way a woman checks a locked door twice before she lets her guard down. History has always told us what women wore, how they spoke, whom they married. But it rarely asked, where did they go? The answer, like so much else in their lives, was hidden beneath propriety and perfumed shame. But now, when you pass a line of women waiting outside a public lavatory, remember this. Every queue is a monument. Every stall, a battleground one. Every flush echoes with stories untold. They waited. They clenched. They suffered, so that others wouldn't have to. And if you ever walk by Victorian chamber pot, behind museum glass, gold-rimmed, floral, absurd, don't laugh. Bow your head instead. It's not a joke. It's a relic of war.